Great. I'd like to thank Greg, Dominic, Chris, and Natalie for speaking on the approach to facilitating and expediting development in oncology, and really to close the gap between development of targeted therapies for adults with inclusion of adolescents. So we'd now like to move into the panel discussion. In addition to the presenters, Lynne Yao and Max Williamson, who is a patient representative, will be joining the discussion. For purposes of time, since we've only got about 15 minutes to really have a meaningful discussion, there's a group of questions that have come in, but really are all around the same topic. And that really is pertaining to really the practicality of the prioritization of products to be developed for children. And I was hoping that we could get some insight from Greg and Dominic, as well as Lynne, on really sort of that, how do companies, really help facilitate the prioritization of the products that are going to be developed for children, and specifically for pediatric oncology, in terms of, trying to be compliant with the regulations, but also being practical in what the approach is going to be for development. And then the second part of that question is really, where does the cluster meetings come in relationship to specifically parallel review, in order to actually reach agreement on pediatric development plans between US and Europe. So really would be interested to hear on that from our panelists. So Lynne, do you have any thoughts, or Greg or Dominic on that?
I can start, Lynne, if
that's great.
Please.
Talking about oncology products specifically. And I think as Dominic made clear in his presentation, as regulators, we don't actually take an active role in the prioritization discussions. Basically, I think we are prohibited to some extent from doing that. But what we do take into consideration are the multi-stakeholder discussions around prioritization, and the input from not only industry sponsors, but also from clinical investigators and translational scientists who may be actually informing to some extent clinical investigators, as well as parents and advocates. So in our decisions that may relate to a particular sponsor's request for a waiver, because a waiver of the requirement for a pediatric assessment based on the fact that there are multiple same-in-class products that either are already being investigated or have been investigated. That the kind of information that emanates from these strategy forum, where the issue of prioritization is discussed, and from the publications from those strategy forum, do help inform the decisions that we provide to companies. So we're not actually actively advising or contributing to these discussions, but actually the information that comes from those discussions helps inform the decisions that we make and the communications that we have with our industry sponsors.
Do you think that the Type F meeting can help sponsors to work with the agency to sort of identify those priorities, if you will? Because I mean, they're looking at a targeted list. I mean, they're moving from adult development with maybe perhaps not an experience in pediatric development, and where they take that targeted therapy, because, again, with multiple options potentially, and how can they, again, help to facilitate that discussion?
I think the Type F meetings have actually been more of a benefit, not so much in the situation of multiple same-in-class products, so products developed and directed at the same target, rather at new and individual targets and companies' questions related to how, why, if there is a role for potential pediatric development. You know, in the guidance that we've published on implementation of Certara Section 504, we've really made it pretty clear that we recognize that there are multiple same-in-class. You know, everybody wants one of these blockbuster Me Too drugs. So we've recognized this, and we recognize that we'll never have the patient population to investigate all of these studies in children, nor should we. So, you know, there are definite, and we probably need to develop a more well-defined conceptual framework for you know, how we make decisions about same-in-class agents. But in general, unless there is a real PK difference, if one product is a better penetrant of the blood-brain barrier and may be an appropriate molecule to treat primary CNS neoplasms, if there's a more favorable toxicity profile, and if there's evidence in either preclinical models or adult clinical models of superior activity or efficacy, you know, then I think, you know, justification for waivers, and, you know, we've provided our agreement to planned waiver requests for multiple same-in-class agents. So I think the Type F meetings are really more beneficial for individual potential targets of interest, much more so than you know, multiple products developed and directed at the same targets.
Okay, great. Now, Dominic, you had mentioned, and I guess this is a question for both you, Greg, and Dominic, is really this concept of deferral. So is it that, you know, when, you know, of course, you know, we're all committed to pediatric research and want to get things done as quickly as possible, but is there an element where we think of deferral as sort of being a reasonable approach because we want to get more information to make more informed decisions when we think about prioritization? So just curious as to what you think about that.
Thanks, Lynn. Yes, indeed, that's exactly the case. And you know, since we can't, as Craig mentioned, since we can't, you know, prioritize ourselves, since we have to assess and review all products and PIPs on its own merit, we have to leverage somehow competition, if you wish, by making use of tools like waivers and deferrals, you know, taking into consideration the evidence as it emerges and as it sort of impacts prioritization discussions, which are then brought forward to us as regulators for further decision making. I think that's exactly the idea, to get a sense of, right, what's the best, what's the product currently with the highest chance of addressing an unmet need in a given population, then that's the one, you know, which should go first, no doubt. And then there might be others, but maybe the knowledge, you know, isn't that mature yet with regard to certain, you know, specifics, or you know, the product is not there yet to be put into a clinical study in children, and that then, you know, would be leveraged through deferrals, or, you know, later on potentially waivers if it shows that this is just not maybe, you know, the class of product for that particular disease. Yeah.
Okay. just sort of bringing in the concept of adolescence into adult trials, when we talk about sort of a level of uncertainty, I'm interested to hear, from the patient side as well as the regulator side, is how much uncertainty is acceptable? Because, when we think from an ethical standpoint, do we need to know more before we start to study compounds in children, and that includes adolescents, to be able to foster as drug development and to move the process along. But I'm just, wondering, if you can elaborate on that. And Lynne, certainly, even for compounds that are not related to oncology, what is the overall view on that? There is the position that's come out that we want to include adolescents in, but I'm just curious if we can speak to that. And Max, perhaps you have a viewpoint on, from the patient perspective as to what is acceptable.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure Chris and Natalie will have something much more insightful to add. I guess from my perspective, and to introduce myself a bit more, I'm a testicular cancer patient. I had cancer when I was 15, and I wasn't a part of a clinical trial, but from speaking to other folks in the community, I think generally we all agree that actually it's just dependent on the severity of the situation that the patient is faced with in terms of managing that amount of risk and communicating that properly. So I think, if we're talking about products that might be used in larger populations that are pediatric, we'd be expecting that there'd be better research and better detail in terms of defining exactly what the risks are in taking them. But fundamentally, a lot of the diseases we're talking about today, as we've talked about all afternoon, are extremely rare. I think a lot of patients and a lot of parents are understanding about how difficult it is to develop the kind of research profile that allows you to really understand what's going to happen when you have these products, when you have these drugs. So I think my rough rule of thumb would be to say that actually risk for a lot of patients is actually it depends on how serious and how severe the kind of situation is in terms of the patient's health, in terms of then having to explain and understand exactly what we have to assess and measure in terms of risk benefit.
Okay, great. So Chris or Natalie, do you have any further thoughts regarding just even the approach to talking to parents and that from that perspective as well?
I think you ask a very good question, Lynne, and I don't think that there is a simple answer. I think it's accepted within the community that the purpose of a clinical trial is for future development of treatments. And although in unusual cases, it may bring immediate benefit to a patient who gets onto that trial, in most cases that is not what will happen. So I think there is a difficult level of decision making about the balance between risk and altruism and the benefit for the individual child, because most innovative trials are happening at the stage of relapse, and you're working with children who in many cases are terminally ill. So it's a very difficult decision to make. From our experience, we were only ever, in the whole year of relapse, we only ever offered one trial. And we decided in that case not to take the trial. We decided it was not sufficiently relevant, and the treatment was too invasive. So I think the message that we try to push here is that the patient community are very keen to be involved with viable clinical trials, and that's where we see is the future. But I think Lynne, there is a case for trying to develop with families when they face the terrible challenge of cancer treatment, developing a kind of literacy about decision making, and providing them with the tools to make critical decisions. And I think what we've been very much pushing the message of is protecting young people, not from research, but through research. But there is another side to that coin, that is that we are aware that there are a number of kind of Me Too trials hanging about out there, which are not particularly bringing benefit to the community, and may not have been developed on very robust terms. So I think it's a question of families talking through with professional support and making a decision. But there are those eternally difficult decisions that are made about the balance between hope and the quality of life in a child's last few months, and those are the most difficult things. But I would say, I mean, two messages: one, protecting children through research, and two, developing a kind of literacy within the patient community to enable them to make scientifically and emotionally literate decisions.
Great. And I think it's interesting that you, sorry, go ahead, Natalie.
I completely agree with Max and Chris. And what I wanted to say is, just as a clinician, I think what is really important for us is to be honest with the younger person, and to really say what we know, what we don't know, what we can expect, what we cannot expect, and they are able to make decision. Then that's really important, to really discuss the issues and the benefit with them. And if you look to the website of Accelerate of the FAIR group, there is a video where an adolescent says clearly, even if it's already finished for me, maybe it will be helpful for others. And if it's not worse for me, then I will go for it. Then they also have a very altruistic reason sometimes to participate to the trials. And this young person that is talking on the video has gone at least for 5 trials. And I think this has been benefit for him, but he has also been very beneficial for the others. And that's something that is also taken into account by the adolescents.
Okay, great. Maybe we can just take that discussion back just a bit back to the prioritization, because I think Chris mentioned, that the decision on sort of these Me Too trials, and again, with sponsors trying to, develop a reasonable plan that has to be compliant with the regulations versus what can be practically implemented. So again, relying on clinicians such as yourself to, as you're discussing these options with patients, whether it be adolescents or even younger children, to, again, that whole idea of balancing what's required from the regulatory standpoint to what can be practically implemented in prioritization. Just curious as to if you have any thoughts on that.
I'm not sure I have properly understand the question, but
so really, I mean, I guess, when you're talking about trying to the inclusiveness of adolescents into trials, and then, is there a component from your standpoint of deciding when it comes to prioritization of different types of studies and how you approach that? So for instance, again, when we're talking about prioritization of research, that we're, as sponsors, are required to do studies, and they're to comply with the regulations, versus what can be practically implemented then, and if what I guess viewpoint do you as a clinician have when you're thinking about enrolling adolescents in trials, and we're encouraging that, then you have choices between multiple trials to include patients in. I didn't, if there's certain considerations.
Okay. I think that the first thing is that at the beginning of the development of a drug, we don't have choice, and we go for the one that will agree to develop the drug on children. And if we go for trials, adult trials that are including adolescents, that's something that can be very early with no data at all in the pediatric population and no clear idea on what is happening in adults. But that can be very useful to have the adolescents included in this first trial to even get a signal in this population specifically that have different cancer from the ones that are developed in adults. And the other thing is that when you have multiple choice, you will choose basically the class of drug that is the most important and the design of the trial that suits you better as a medical oncologist or pediatric oncologist. And the forum of the Accelerate forum are very, very useful for that, because you have not just the regulatory and the industry, you have the academic, you have the point of view of the academic on what is needed from a medical point of view, from an academic point of view, what has been done and what can be done by industry, and how the regulatory can help on that. Then that kind of prioritization forum are very important.
Great.